So the first thing I want to talk about is like this general timeline of what happened in Ukraine since 2014. I think for folks who may have just a little bit of knowledge of what's going on, they may say, okay, something happened, some crisis happened in 2014 in Ukraine, and there's been a lot of conflicts going on in the country since then. And today we have some sort of right-wing, conservative, maybe even fascist forces in Ukraine that are fighting on the border of Russia, and there's just some crazy stuff going on. Can you give, does that sound right? Can you go in a little bit more detail about that generalization?
But let me start with a story from today. Our new Global Network board member, Leonid, who we met last spring when we went to Moscow, and then he came with us to Crimea, speaks 10 languages. He's from Ukraine. He's from Lugansk in eastern Ukraine, Russian-speaking part of the country that's closest to the Russian border. He had to leave the country after the 2014 coup d'etat that the U.S. sponsored. But anyway, today he sent me a message, an email from Lugansk, where he was, saying that he was sitting celebrating just having gotten a Russian passport. Putin's made it possible for people from Ukraine to now have basically dual citizenship if they wish in Russia. So it's a bureaucratic process. He's been back and forth between Moscow and Lugansk getting it set. But today he got it and he's celebrating. And he said he was sitting drinking some wine with a bunch of former coal miners who today are members of the quote unquote resistance. I call them self-defense forces. So this is really the story of what's happened since 2014. In 2014, there was a US NATO-led coup d'etat in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, a color revolution, which the United States has been sponsoring throughout Eastern Europe and the former Soviet bloc countries ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. And in this case, U.S. really wanted Ukraine terribly for several reasons. One is it's next door to Russia. It borders Russia. It was also the most industrialized, profitable of all the former Soviet bloc countries. U.S. wanted it. It also has some of the best soil in the entire Europe, and Monsanto wants it. And finally, Ukraine had Crimea, which was the historic, ever since the late 1700s, was the Russian main warm water naval base port. And the US NATO wanted that, saying if we can get a hold of Ukraine, we can take Crimea, then we will have a base right on Russia's border, a Navy base, and we would block Russia from having that. That's a huge military advantage. So all these reasons led to this coup in 2014, where the US installed a puppet regime that was under the control of Washington, Brussels, NATO headquarters in Brussels. And the first thing that the new government did was outlaw the speaking of Russian in the country, which was ludicrous because Russian and Ukraine were the two top languages, sort of equal, if you will. Many people spoke both, especially people in eastern Ukraine along the Russian border. They spoke primarily Russian, whereas on the western side of Ukraine, over by Poland, they tend to speak Ukrainian. And also on that western side of the country is a city called Lviv. And in this city is a stronghold of the Nazi forces that today are attacking the people on the eastern side of the country, closest to the Russian border. During World War II, when Hitler launched his invasion of the former Soviet Union, where ultimately 28 million Soviet citizens were killed fighting the Nazis. When Hitler swept into Ukraine and came through Western Ukraine, there was a nationalist there by the name of Stefan Bandera who put on a Nazi uniform, gathered his nationalist forces, joined Hitler's army, killed thousands, tens of thousands of Polish civilians, Jews in the Western Ukraine area, and then joined the invasion for the rest of the country. The people of Russia today are very clear about who these Nazis are, and they still exist, and they still flourish. And the U.S. has been encouraging them, has been arming and training them. In fact, the U.S. has set up a military base in Western Ukraine. There's videos about it. People want to contact me, I can send you the video where the Obama's ambassador to Ukraine made a journey on a train to this base, and he met with U.S. Special Forces soldiers from Fort Carson, Colorado, who were shipped in, rotated in to train these Nazis who have been brought into a National Guard, which they never had before, which is now composed of mostly these Nazi forces. And they're then sent to the eastern side of the country to shell, to attack civilians, hospitals, airports, schools, daycare centers, rail stations, churches, all kinds of civilian housing areas, housing blocks, towers, civilian houses out in the countryside. And more than 10,000 people have been killed since 2014. The U.S. claims that Russia invaded Ukraine. There's never been an ounce of proof. There's never been one photo of any Russian forces there. The people that have been fighting against this onslaught by these Nazis that are sent by the United States have been largely the coal miners that came out of the eastern Ukraine coal mines right near the Russian border. As their families were being attacked, they came out of those coal mines. They put on uniforms. They gathered weapons that they got from retreating Ukrainian army forces who left them behind, or they got them in weapons depots that were in their region from the old days of the Soviet Union. And they armed themselves and they fought back and pushed back against these Nazis who were attacking them. And so today there's what they call a line of contact, just really meters on either side. On the eastern side near the Russian border are the coal miners and musicians and former electricians and teachers and all just regular people who join these self-defense forces to protect their families. And just on the other side of the contact line are these Nazis and these regular Ukrainian army forces that, again, the US and NATO are arming and training and funding and directing, having them go against the people of Eastern Ukraine, whose only crime is that they speak Russian and that they live near the Russian border.
I want to talk about how dangerous of a situation this is. I was recently in Germany not too long ago, and I had a deep conversation with a friend about fascism in Germany, but generally in Europe overall. And he used, and when he described Ukraine, he called it, quote, the Mecca of fascism today, unquote. And I think that is a very serious situation, and especially where I've read reports where people from Germany, or actually, I shouldn't say people, fascists from Germany and fascists from the US are traveling, and actually fascists from around the world are traveling to Ukraine, and they are linking up with fascists there to learn about what they learned and are learning through their conflicts, through what happened, so that these fascists can take their stories and learn their skills and experiences and bring them back to the U.S., to Germany, to wherever they are. And also, that you said that since 2014, 10,000 people have died in this conflict in the past, 5 years now. 10,000 people. It's like, would you describe this as a war or just like some type of a conflict?
I'd call it a war. I mean, out of those 10,000, some of those have been soldiers on both sides, but mostly they've been civilians. I mean, I daily, literally daily for the last 5 years, watch videos. You've probably seen that I've posted many on the Global Network Facebook page, my own Facebook page, and my blog, Organizing Notes. I post these videos of these mostly civilians whose homes are being attacked, their relatives, their neighbors have been killed, their houses are burnt down, their gardens, they can't even go out and tend their gardens anymore for fear that they'll be shot, because just literally meters away are these Nazis waiting for someone to pop their head up. I mean, it's definitely a war. There's no doubt about it. I agree. I've seen pictures of American fascists who have gone to Ukraine and met with the Ukrainian fascists. And as you say, they are learning from them and, having solidarity meetings. And I've also seen pictures from 2014 in the Maidan. The Maidan was the square in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, where the so-called revolution took place, what I would call a coup d'etat, directed by the US, by the CIA, by the National Endowment for Democracy, by George Soros's Open Society Foundations that funded Ukrainian NGOs for years, training them how to set this whole coup in motion. And so there are pictures of John McCain, former senator from, right-wing senator from Arizona. He's now passed away. He was standing with Nazis in Maidan, in the square, on the stage, supporting them, encouraging them, making them believe that the United States supported them. Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, also has gone there with McCain. And even Amy Klobuchar, the so-called Democrat liberal from Minnesota, who's now running for president in the Democratic primaries, she was with Lindsey McCain and John McCain and Lindsey Graham meeting with these Nazis in Ukraine. So not only have Nazis gone there, but members of the Congress have gone there to encourage them, support them. Joe Biden, when Obama was president, it was Joe Biden's job. He was sort of in charge of this whole operation in Ukraine. And one of the first things he did was he got his son appointed to the board of directors of the Ukrainian Oil Corporation so that his son would make big money off this whole operation. So this thing is supported by both parties, Republicans and Democrats. It's a coup, and the purpose of it is to destabilize Russia. And they've been very successful at it. And sadly, the people in Ukraine are suffering terribly from it. What Russia does do, I've seen the white trucks, they send convoys and convoys of white trucks loaded with medical aid, food for the people in the Donbass, this area of eastern Ukraine, near the Russian border, with the big cities of Lugansk and Donetsk that have declared themselves independent. Originally, the people in these cities held marches. After 2014, the new government was installed, the puppet government in Kiev. After the coup, they declared, speaking of Russian illegal, people in eastern Ukraine responded with peaceful marches. And they held gatherings where people signed petitions saying they wanted to be able to have local autonomy. Okay, there's now this fascist propped up government in Kiev. We want local autonomy. So they weren't even saying we want to join Russia at that time. They weren't. But as they started getting attacked, murdered, their people were apprehended, taken and put in like dungeons in Ukraine, tortured, killed by the Ukrainian forces. Uh, Slowly but surely, over a couple of years, they just said, "We've had enough of this. We don't want anything to do with Ukraine anymore. We want to be like the people of Crimea. We want to have a vote and say we want to join Russia." But Putin and the Russian government have not really wanted to carve out this piece of Ukraine. They've said, no, let's see if we can have a ceasefire. Let's see if we can get the Ukrainian government to agree to a process of giving autonomy to the eastern region, the Donbass region, but that people would stay within Ukrainian nation. And so the Minsk negotiations were held in Belarus, and the United States, Russia, France, Germany, and Ukraine were involved in those, and they came to an agreement, a ceasefire, a line of contact, everybody pull your forces back. But since that time, the Ukrainian Nazis, again under the direction of the United States, have been constantly violating that agreement, continuing to shell the people up to this very day.
I want to talk about a little bit more about the U.S.'s role there. Well, first I want to make a comment about John McCain and Joe Biden supporting the fascists in Ukraine. I mean, I remember when John McCain died, and even from the so-called veteran left community were like sympathetic to John McCain's death, and especially the younger veterans who are or newer veterans. I would share these pictures of John McCain with the fascist organizations there and leaders there, and they just like had no idea that happened. And I'm sure a lot of people, do not even know about Joe Biden's son and Joe Biden's involvement in Ukraine, and now he's running for president. And if he does become president, which I don't think is likely, but if he does, like that involvement, U.S. involvement in Ukraine is probably only going to increase. And so I think it was a good point of showing how like not just our military, but Congress and also U.S. fascists, they're all on the same side here when it comes to Ukraine. But I want to talk a little bit more about the U.S.'s role there. And I kind of want to split it into, you touched on what they're doing now a little bit, but I also want to touch on like, what was the original intention of the U.S. wanting a coup in Ukraine? I've been writing a little bit about this on the Peace Report, trying to emphasize the idea of what I call border destabilization. And I think this is a very, very common old strategy and tactic that the Pentagon use and the State Department and Washington uses, that a lot of the U.S. left and peace and anti-war movement seem to like really not have a good analysis around, because it's not directly dropping bombs on a certain country or population, but Ukraine shares a decent sized border with Russia. And if there's fascist right-wing elements or any type of destabilization on the border of Ukraine, like that's going to be a threat to Russia, just like if, like, I don't know, just any country came into the U.S.-Mexico border and started putting in fascists at the Mexico border and started destabilizing that border, like that would be a threat to the U.S. national security. But what, for your reason, why did the U.S. even get involved in the 2004 coup and 2014 crisis in Ukraine? What was the original intention? What's the point of the U.S. being involved in that? They could be anywhere in the world, but why there?
Well, Diana Johnstone, who's an American but lives in Paris, she's a journalist. I remember reading her writing all the way back into the 80s. She's one of the best journalists around on issues of the European area and, up to Russia. She wrote an article following the coup d'etat it was fabulous, and told the story about a meeting that was held where at this time the United States was really pushing Ukraine hard to reject an economic relationship with Russia, but instead turn towards Europe and have economic relationship with Europe. And the president Yanukovych, duly elected in Ukraine, wanted to have it both ways. He wanted to trade with both. He wanted to trade with Europe, and his neighbor, Ukraine borders Russia. They have a lot of trade. The majority of their trade was with Russia historically, and in 2014 as well. And so he wanted to do both, and that was not acceptable to the U.S. You have to pick one or the other. So she writes this article about this meeting where this was all discussed, and all the players were there. The Clintons were there, and Russia was there. Ukrainians were there, of course, and all these other NATO people were there. And Russians said, this will be a disaster if you, don't trade with us as well. It's really going to hurt the Ukrainian economy. It's not a good idea. And they proved to be true, as the U.S. essentially forced. And that was one of the reasons for this coup, along with all the other reasons I earlier explained, the other benefits for the U.S. and NATO. One thing that I think is key in understanding all this is climate change, the melting of the Arctic ice. Look at a map and see which country on the planet has the largest land border with the Arctic Sea. And of course, that's Russia. The Rand Corporation, based in Santa Monica, California, has a study that recently they've announced that their goal is to break Russia into pieces. That study, I have linked to it. It's available online.
And the Rand Corporation is somewhat like a right-wing think tank, basically, right? A pro-military, pro-American exceptionalist think tank, right?
That's correct. So anyway, the goal then is, okay, why does Rand want to break Russia up into pieces? Well, it's obvious that the oil corporations, the Western or oil corporations, the United States, Britain, Dutch, all those together, they want access to that huge region to drill, baby, drill. Because now they can get at the oil and natural gas that's been hidden below that ice for all these years because the ice is melting. And so if they can break Russia up into smaller countries, balkanize it, then they think they would have better access. So this is a key to all of this. And partly in order to do that, they have to surround Russia with military forces. So by demonizing Russia, as they have, the only piece of evidence I've ever seen anyone really actually say that they had about Russia interference in the last election in the United States was that some people like you and I were interviewed on RT before the election, where we talked about these issues. And frankly, RT is one of the few places that people like you and I can be interviewed anymore. Mainstream American media won't touch us with a 10-foot pole.
Yep.
And so that's really the extent of the so-called Russian interference. The whole DNC hacks, it's been proven overwhelmingly by VIPs, Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, William Benny, Ray McGovern, Benny with the NSA, McGovern, former CIA analyst. They've proven overwhelmingly that it was a inside person made copies of the DNC files, gave them to Julian Assange. There's a guy from England, former ambassador, British ambassador. His name is escaping me this second. I'll probably think of it as we go along. But anyway, he says, yeah, I know all about this because I was the person that met another person in the woods near American University in Washington, D.C., who handed me the files. I then handed them to Julian Assange. So this whole hack thing, Russiagate thing, has been an excuse to further demonize Russia, so that in the minds of the American people and the people of Europe, the NATO countries, it makes sense to them that the U.S. should and NATO should expand bases, surround and encircle Russia, because Russia is a demon. Russia wants to recreate the form of the Soviet Union. Russia wants to take over the world. But you know, the numbers don't lie. The U.S. military budget this year is 800 and some billion. When you add in all the other pots of gold and other agencies that are not part of the Pentagon budget, it's well over $1 trillion a year. Russian military budget this year is just over $60 billion, 60 billion with a B. Nothing in compared to U.S. and NATO budget. When you add in the NATO budgets, it's even greater. And in the last 2 years, Russia has cut their military budget because Putin said there's too much poverty in their country, 18% poverty. They're trying to deal with it. So there's no way in hell that Russia could be a threat to the United States and NATO or anybody else. It's all a lie.
There's one way that Russia is a threat, is that they've basically, it's a little bit more complex, but basically they've kind of nationalized their oil sources and their banks. So meaning that the U.S. Wall Street, U.S. corporate interests can't get their dirty little hands on that. And especially, like you said earlier, with the Arctic Circle melting, and more oil will be easily accessible, and also trade routes, which is, you know, Russia has the largest border there. And if Russia's not giving Wall Street everything that it wants, then then they become a threat, a so-called threat, right? And also to add on to what you're saying about Ukraine, the border of Russia with Russiagate, all this stuff. I was recently in Finland, not kind of recently, and, you know, U.S. and NATO, even though Finland is not officially a part of NATO, was conducting these large-scale military exercises. And Finland shares a huge border with Russia, not to mention a lot of the surveillance capabilities that where these, if you look at the how the internet is actually made up around the world, it's like these huge cords, these huge wires that connect the whole entire world. There's these huge cables that come, I'll use cables that come from Russia in order to go to Europe and other places around the world. But the first place they go through is the Baltic Sea and through Finland, and the U.S. wants to, you know, if Finland is that first point that exits, that where the cable exits out of Russia, then like they want Finland to be able to access that cable and hand that information over to the U.S. and NATO forces. Not to mention having these large-scale military training exercises on Russia's doorstep is a threat to their national security, just like if Russia or any other country were to ever do that on the Mexican border or off the coast of California or New York City.
Or Canada.
Yeah, I guess so. But yeah, exactly.
You know, that's the hypocrisy here, the blinding hypocrisy. You don't have to be a fan of Putin. You don't have to be a fan of Russia. That's not what this is about. You just have to believe in sovereignty, national sovereignty. Every country should be left alone. We should leave Russia alone. Leave them alone. Leave Ukraine alone. Leave them alone. Everybody leave us alone, okay? Leave Venezuela alone. Leave Syria alone. Stop deciding that the United States has a right to interfere everywhere around the world. It's wrong.
Okay, I want to actually talk about the lack of involvement from the U.S. left, activists, organizers, peace and anti-war people, and anyone who's generally progressive or somewhere on the left, why there is such a lack of involvement on this issue in Ukraine, but also to acknowledge, well, first of all, let me just kind of ask you a simple question to make my point. If there is somewhat of a World War III or something kind of, or really major, some major outbreak of fascism, like there was in World War II, do you think it would come, like the base of it would come from Ukraine, or is there other, I can't think of a stronger area in the world that has more fascist sentiments and ideologies brewing up right now? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, this spark, this hot spark could be lit in many, many, many places that could start World War III. That would be the end of all life on this planet. Because if it goes to World War III, weapons are now on hair trigger alert. Humans really don't have command anymore. Computers take control. One example, let me share this. I think it's very important. U.S. has built a missile launch base in Romania and today is building one in Poland. They will be able to fire first strike attack cruise missiles that would fly from Romania and Poland and hit Moscow in 10 minutes. So the Russians now have to put their nuclear retaliatory capability on what's called launch on warning status because there's not time for human decision-making process. The U.S. first strike attack is something that the Space Command actually war games every year. They call it the red team versus the blue team. They practice a first strike attack on Russia and China. And then after the first strike is launched, the other side expectedly fires what remaining retaliatory capability they have left because the U.S. in the first strike tries to take out their nuclear forces, air, land, sea, whatever, in this really massive decapitation attack. So they fire their remaining retaliatory capability, Russia and China does, in this war game run by the Space Command. And it is then that these so-called missile defense systems are used to try to pick off any remaining nuclear capability that Russia or China would fire in a retaliatory strike, giving the U.S. a quote-unquote successful first strike attack. So Russia and China both know that they are being targeted. Their nuclear forces that they say are defensive, both Russia and China have ruled out ever doing a first strike. They declared no first strike ever. The United States refuses to do so. And Russia and China, though, have been saying for more than 10 years that as much as we would like to disarm nuclear weapons, we're eager to do it. We can't afford to as long as the United States is encircling us and deploying these so-called missile defense systems that are really key elements, the shield to be used after a first strike sword launches into the heart of Russia and China. So they said we can't really reduce our nuclear weapons unless the United States ends these missile defense deployments that used to be outlawed under the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty that the U.S. withdrew from in 2002. So here with bases in Poland and Romania today, the U.S. able to hit Russia in 10 minutes, and it would be the equivalent of Russia or China having bases in Mexico and Canada, right on our border, being able to strike Washington in just a few moments' notice. The U.S. would go insane if anybody tried to put bases on our borders. We do it, hey, no problem. You know why? It's no problem because the American people don't know anything about it. And that's because the mainstream corporate-owned media doesn't report this story.
And that's a reason why people should support the Peace Report, independent media, so that we can get the word out.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's talk about, I think you got a petition that you started to try to raise awareness about this issue, but I don't know. I don't want to talk about it too much. I just want you to explain it. What's this petition about?
Well, I was recently in Russia in the spring of this year. You were there on our study tour. We went to Moscow, Crimea, and St. Petersburg. But the October before this past spring, I went to Russia, to Moscow and Crimea on a organizing trip because I'd never been to Russia before. I had very few contacts. So I went really to prepare for our spring study tour. And while I was in Moscow, I just fortunately coincided with a conference being organized by a guy named Leonid, who when we went to Moscow, and Crimea was one of our guides, and we've become friends. And one man at this conference was a labor union leader from Lugansk in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, near the Russian border. And he was really a wonderful guy, spoke very good English. I was able to have very good communication with him. We ate breakfast several times together during that conference. And we stayed in touch. And recently he sent me an email and he asked me, would I consider making a petition and spreading it around the world, calling on the US and Canadian government to stop selling weapons to these right-wing forces, these Nazi forces in Ukraine. And I said I would gladly do so, and I did, and I've been circulating it ever since. But it's difficult because a lot of people don't know about these issues, as we've already discussed, and they're afraid to sign such a petition because, they don't really know too much about this, and what about the Russians and all that kind of stuff. So without, a lot of context, people are a little nervous about signing such a petition. But anyway, that's what I'm still circulating it as I go along.
Yeah, so for our listeners who are listening to this on any podcast platform or app, I'll put the link to the petition in the show notes. Do us all a favor, just go there, check it out. Hopefully you'll agree with it and sign it. I think there's a lot of people that just don't believe in petitions or anything like that. But, when we got people trying to raise awareness and to try to do things and make connections to people on the ground in these impacted areas, like just sign it and show a little bit of solidarity. It takes a few seconds to fill out your name and email or whatever the petition is asking you to do. And that shouldn't really be a big problem. Yeah.
Let me just say about the petition, anybody from any country can sign it. The petition is really an educational piece. It's got videos and articles linked to the petition itself. So when you go to the petition page, you'll see some good articles and some videos explaining all of these things in greater detail. So it's really an educational, that's really what's behind it, is to help expand the consciousness about what's happening in Ukraine.
Tell us the lack of interest and involvement from the U.S. left.
Well, to really understand this issue, you have to read international media, because you're not going to learn anything about Ukraine in mainstream Western media, because it's all BS. And so that means you got to read some Russian media, some alternative media from other parts of the world that are really on the ball about what's happening with this. And a lot of people, number one, are, I hate to say it, lazy. They want to look at the Washington Post and the New York Times, watch MSNBC, and they think they know what's going on. So some people just don't want to do the work. That's number one. Number two, they're afraid to. They're afraid that, if I go and read, Russian media or some other media, from the self-defense forces, the people of Donbass, these people could be communists or something, I can't do that. So it's all the legacy of the Red Scare in America, this fear that I might get on a list. The government might notice that I'm, they might call me a Putin bot, or that I've been Putinized. And so this fear, this whole Russiagate thing in Congress has been really used intentionally to create this fear in the American people and the people in the West that they shouldn't go near this issue. They shouldn't know anything about it because it would mean you've somehow been Putinized. And I think this is a grave, grave danger. And it even seeps into the so-called left. I've seen it for years now, and it's a real problem. It's a real tragedy. Because people are really missing the boat. And, I see people on the left who say they want to get rid of nuclear weapons, for example, and they won't talk about missile defense. And again, as I said a few minutes ago, Russia and China have been saying for 10 years, if you really want to get rid of nuclear weapons, we got to talk about missile defense. and the U.S. missile defense deployments encircling Russia and China. But many people on the left, they don't want to hear that. I've mentioned it on email forums and at meetings and all kinds of things. People don't want to hear it. No. I can't talk about what the United States is doing to encircle Russia and China. I can't go near that. And sometimes it's all about funding. It's about funding from foundations and rich individuals who give money to certain people in the peace movement. And the people or foundations that give this money are linked to the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party does not want people on the left to break away from the mainstream Democratic Party line. For example, some years ago, one particular foundation put out the word to its donors, not to its donors, but to its grant recipients, that they could no longer use the word disarmament. They had to use the words arms control, which really means, some weapons are acceptable. That's arms control. Disarmament means get rid of the weapons. So the foundation, Democratic Party linked foundation, said you can't use that word in disarmament anymore. Why? Because the movement was growing, the disarmament movement was growing and putting too much pressure on the Democrats who wanted to continue to fund the military industrial complex. They get donations from these weapons corporations, and they wanted to control the movement so that it was not putting so much pressure on them. Now you're not allowed to talk about that in America. You're not allowed to talk about that in the left, where some people get their money and the restrictions that are put on them. That's like sacrosanct to move into that territory. But that's a reality that we have today. And it's one reason why the left is so quiet. And it's one reason why academia is so quiet about this whole issue of Ukraine and Russia and everything else, is because a lot of academia also gets money. State university systems, colleges are having their budgets cut because of fiscal crisis in America. They turn to foundations, corporations for funding. And so strings come with that money. You can't talk about certain things. And so academia then, which influences the left, oftentimes writes the articles for the left that the left uses at the so-called left-wing think tanks. So it's all linked together, and few are willing to talk about it. Virtually no one talks about this on the left, but it's real.
Yeah, I think there's a term that a lot of people use today when describing all the problems that you just described, and that's the nonprofit industrial complex. And I think the general line people should have when thinking about the nonprofit industries, especially in the peace and anti-war circles, is that I feel like generally the more funding, the larger budgets a nonprofit organization will have, the less radical they'll be, and they'll be more worried about their representation and to be appealing to more people, to more people to join and donate to their cause and their organization. But then if you have like the smaller nonprofits, who aren't really beholden to these large grants and loans or grants really, then they can be more radical and they can speak out a little bit more in depth in whatever issue they're facing. I feel like that's just a very general line to understand how all these nonprofits work. Not to mention, there are a lot of staffers who join these nonprofit organizations, and they very well have their own interests at heart than what the goal and mission of that nonprofit is. A lot of staffers want to advance their careers, right? So they want to make sure they become the most appealing, most attractive staffer, and the work that they do really represents through their work so they can advance their careers. And a lot of times that is at odds of what the actual mission of that nonprofit is. And then a lot of people, of course, they want to represent that they have good workers, good staff, and they want to continue to have their large scale funding. And that becomes a conflict of interest with their actual goal, because the goal could have been when they started off was very small. It's like, we need to do this very radical thing. And then eventually it just evolves into this other thing.
Well, currently in the Democratic Party debates, the presidential race, there's 22 Democrats running. Only one of them is talking about foreign policy. That's Tulsi Gabbard, representative from Hawaii. And she's being continually demonized by the mainstream media because she dares talk about these, as she calls them, these regime change wars. She dared go and meet with Assad, the president of Syria. Now, I've seen pictures of Nancy Pelosi, John Kerry. They met with Assad. Nobody demonized them. But when Tulsi Gabbard did it, she was demonized. And her position is that the alternative to talking with people, whether you like them or not, is war. And we've had enough of these wars. There's been enough of our soldiers that are dying. There's $4 trillion have been wasted on these regime change wars, she says. Money that could have gone for healthcare and education and repairing our infrastructure, cleaning up our environment back here at home. So it's not allowed. It's not allowed to talk like this. And when you do, you get punished.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we'll see other members of Congress do the same exact thing, but then when someone like Tulsi Gabbard does it, they get demonized, and that's just where not even just right-wing forces, that's where the rest of the Democratic Party attacks these more leftist, more progressive members of Congress.
And so people get the message: keep your head down, keep your mouth shut.
Exactly. I want to talk about one more point you mentioned about missile defense, and that is a huge thing that the peace and anti-war movement really are just not spot on. And I want to emphasize the importance of missile defense. One, out of all the operations that the U.S. military is doing, and out of the military budget and all, it's only a few $1 billion that actually go to missile defense, and that may not seem like a big deal. But the threat and the impacts that these missile defense systems have when they're deployed on the borders of Russia, on the borders of China, on the borders of North Korea, on the borders of Iran, all around the world, the bang for their buck ratio is just amazing from the military industrial complex side, from the Pentagon side. In order to spend just a few billion dollars is a lot from our perspective, but when you add in the almost $1.5 trillion yearly annual budget of the military, a few $1 billion is nothing in that sense, right? And in order to spend few $1 billion on these systems that deploy all around the world that can really have huge impacts on very large nations like Russia and China, but also the smaller ones like North Korea, I mean, that's a win-win for them, right? And then because it's such a small budget and not people really know that it's a missile defense system where it's not actually dropping bombs or whatever, that they're like, oh, well, I'm not going to worry about it. So that's a win-win-win for the Pentagon and the military industrial complex.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I think you're right on with that point. Very important point.
All right. So we've been speaking with Bruce Gagnon. He's the coordinator of the organization Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. He's a dear friend of mine, a lifelong peace and anti-war activist, a Vietnam-era veteran, and expert in space and missile defense issues, and he's been following very closely on this issue of Ukraine. So if you can, check out the petition in the show notes, check out his website, or the Global Network's website, space4peace.org, space4peace.org. And Bruce, can you plug anything else, like such as your blog?
Yeah, my blog, Organizing Notes. I work on it every day. I post things every single day. It's kind of my spiritual practice. It's kind of like a online uh, diary, things I'm working on, things I'm participating in, things I'm concerned about, things I'm learning. So it's people from all over the world read it in order to kind of keep up with my work and what I'm learning and doing. And I write poetry from time to time. I wrote a poem yesterday, put it on there, call it what it is. Let me just read a couple stanzas. It's not about defense. It's offense, full spectrum dominance, first strike decapitation. Don't call it defense. It's the War Department, not the Defense Department. And then it goes on. Anyway, so that's Organizing Notes, my blog. Check it out.
Also, you can follow the Global Network on Twitter at GN space for peace. And with the same name, you can follow them on YouTube, where they're starting a new YouTube channel. Plenty of videos from their trip to Russia, Crimea, St. Petersburg, Moscow. GN space for peace. Bruce, thanks for joining us at the Peace Report. I really appreciate your insight.
Thank you, Will. Thanks for all your work.